rebellious disruption, mental disorder, disability. Let's add another D word to our discussion of genius, destruction. Destruction, it turns out, is necessary to change as well as to progress. And change, it turns out, is something of a zero-sum game. For every new idea or mode of thinking that enters the world, an old one disappears, becomes obsolescent, falls into oblivion. This timeless evolutionary process was highlighted by Harvard economics professor Joseph Strumpeter back in 1942, and eventually termed creative destruction. Creative destruction is most obviously at work in the tech world. The inventor of the wheel put the maker of the drag sled out of business. Solar heating is today sending coal miners into other lines of work. Drive-up ATMs are making bank tellers unnecessary, and internet shopping forces shopping malls to close. We all know this. As Alan Greenspan, a former head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, expressed it, quote, "Destruction is more than just an unfortunate side effect of creation. It is part and parcel of the same thing." Society generally seems willing to accept this trade-off, embracing innovation and forgetting the flip side, destruction. Annually, the TV network CNBC not only accepts but honors, quote, the top 50 disruptors of the year, praising innovative private startups that advance the most significant disruptive technology, end quote. And transformative geniuses are comfortable with this disruption. In 2011, Forbes magazine published an article titled, "Steve Jobs, Create, Disrupt, and Destroy," saying in it, "No person has done more to disrupt the existing way of doing things than Mr. Jobs," end quote. Jobs was willing to destroy his own darling, the hugely popular iPod. You remember that, of course, because genius Jobs eventually came to see the target that no one else could see, that the future of digital music resided in, who knew, a telephone. Thus, we are willing to accept the creative destruction that attends the progress wrought by such geniuses. But what about the personal destruction? The change brought by genius seems to come at a cost to those immediately around them. Perhaps the most surprising conclusion from my years of study of genius is this: many great minds are not so great human beings. We have a tendency to want our geniuses to be superheroes, the highest form of the human species. Yet on a personal level, the genius almost always disappoints us. The genius is often a jerk. Readers of my book on genius are surprised by this fact, and so too, over the years, were my students. At the beginning of each iteration of the Genius course at Yale, the one that you're engaged here in an online form, I invariably ask the question, how many of you want to be a genius? Usually, at the beginning, about 3/4 of the class affirmatively respond. Some enthusiastically, others tentatively. In the last class, I asked, now having studied all these geniuses, how many of you still want to be one? And now only about 1/4 of the group says, I do. As one student volunteered, at the beginning of the course, I thought I did, but now I'm not so sure. So many of them seem like obsessive, self-centered jerks, not the kind of person I'd want as a friend or a suite mate. Point taken, obsessive and self-centered jerks. Why do they behave this way? I suspect it's because they can't help themselves. Many geniuses seem to be so obsessed with their view of changing the world that they are oblivious to the psychological damage that their obsessions cause. As the genius races ahead down the path to creative change, the rest of us, spouses, children, colleagues, co-workers, all become roadkill, collateral damage. Are there any transformative geniuses who remained decent human beings? Surely there must be. I suppose on my list I'd put maybe Leonardo da Vinci, Charles Darwin, Toni Morrison, but in truth, I don't know much about their private lives. Marie Curie seems to have been a very moral person, but as we have seen, not an ideal parent. Nikola Tesla was smart enough to realize implicitly that genius may not be compatible with marriage and family. As he said in 1897, "I don't think you can name many great inventions that have been made by married men. It's a pity, too, for sometimes we, the unmarried or unpartnered genius, we feel so lonely," end quote. Indeed, more than half of the iconic geniuses that I have studied chose not to marry and left no progeny. But for those who did marry, getting married or partnered seems to provide no stability. It doesn't seem to reduce the psychic turmoil, and separation or divorce often follows. Among the great American writers alone, look at these numbers. Norman Mailer had 6 wives, Henry Miller and Saul Bellow 5, Ernest Hemingway and Tennessee Williams 4, Arthur Miller, Eugene O'Neill, and John Steinbeck 3. What about the great American women writers of the 20th century? Well, Pearl Buck, Toni Morrison, Ayn Rand, Anne Sexton, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, for example. The highest number of husbands I can find is only 2. Several conclusions might be drawn from this, but I'll leave those conclusions to you. Let's stick with male malefactors, familially dysfunctional male geniuses. Walter Isaacson has written half a dozen fine biographies, and he points out the following flaws of Ben Franklin, for example, who abandoned his wife and children for long stretches, and Albert Einstein, who failed to acknowledge an illegitimate daughter and put a son in a Swiss mental institution where he lived unvisited by Father Albert for a decade. But only in Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, among biographies of genius, do we find this. Do we find an index entry under offensive behavior of? And there are so many instances of bad behavior, we need to start an entire index category. Said Chris Ann Brennan, Steve Jobs' first wife, quote, "He was an enlightened being who was cruel. That's a strange combination," end quote. To his readers, author Charles Dickens epitomized human kindness and all that was good in family life, and seems to have invented Christmas as we know it, as in The Christmas Story. But here's what his daughter, Katie, his favorite child, said about him after Dickens' death. "He did not care a damn what happened to any of us. Nothing could surpass the misery and unhappiness of our home." If you think that's bad, here's what Ernest Hemingway's son, Gregory Hemingway, said about him in 1951. Quote, "When it's all added up," he's writing to his father here, "when it's all added up, Papa, Hemingway, it will be, he wrote a few good stories, had a fresh approach to reality, and he destroyed 5 persons, Hadley, Pauline, Marty, Patrick, and possibly myself. Which do you think is the most important, you self-centered shit? The stories or the people? I suspect you wonder what's happened to my filial respect for you. Well, it's gone, Ernestine dear, it's gone. It's gone with the 100,000 cruelties you have inflicted on people for the last 10 years. End quote. Nobel Prize-winning Hemingway was a bully, a brawler, a liar, an adulterer, and an alcoholic. He wanted to engage in macho, hyper-masculine activities, to go to bullfights in Madrid and to run with the bulls in Pamplona and to kill animals in Africa. The type of activities that he could then write about. Thinking of the world from the point of view of the other and being sensitive to the transgendered son, Gregory, for example, was not part of the persona or image that Hemingway wanted to create. Martha Gellhorn, who lived with Hemingway for 9 years, 5 of which as his third wife, said this of Hemingway in 1945, before she divorced him. Quote, "A man," Hemingway, "a man must be a very great genius to make up for being such a loathsome human being." Was Thomas Edison a loathsome human being? Edison's first wife, Mary, was described by an historian as a fully fledged casualty of her husband's accumulated neglect, end quote. His second wife, Mina, called Edison the most difficult husband in America. And Edison generally seemed to have had an unconcerned attitude about people in general. He once told an assistant, "We must look out for short-circuited wires, for if we ever kill a customer, it would be very bad for business," end quote. And then there's the story of Edison and Topsy the elephant. In 1885, Edison began a campaign to publicly discredit alternating current, the type championed by his rival, Nikola Tesla. Edison claimed that alternating current's capacity for higher voltages was synonymous with death. To make the point, Edison engaged an assistant to round up stray dogs and subject them to high-voltage AC current. From there, he moved up to calves and then horses and then humans, encouraging the state of New York to adopt the AC electric chair, which it did. And finally, he orchestrated the execution of an elephant, one Topsy, at Coney Island Amusement Park in 1903. Edison orchestrated the event and even set over a film crew to record it with his new motion picture technology. The short film survives today. It's available on YouTube. It's there, but best not to watch it. Given the inhumane behavior of Thomas Edison, why does he remain a national hero in the United States and revered as well in China? Why do we continue to lionize geniuses such as Edison, Hemingway, and Jobs? To what sort of standard should we hold our geniuses? This brings us to the question of our next segment, genius in the age of cancel culture.